Adelaide Finley had a talent for many things: fine needlework, apple preserves, and the particular art of saying cruel things with a kind smile stretched across her face. It was a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1874 when she first pointed at the hill above Caldwell Creek and made her declaration to the women gathered outside the dry goods store on Main Street. The sun was just beginning to muscle its way above the flat Texas horizon, painting the dust in shades of amber and rust, and the town was stirring itself awake with the slow, reluctant energy of a dog too warm to rise from the porch. The women had gathered the way women do in small towns, not for any particular purpose, but because the world moves faster when there are enough of you to watch it together. "That poor, wretched man," Adelaide said, pressing the back of her gloved hand to her cheek in a gesture so practiced it had nearly become sincere. She was looking up at the hillside where a modest but sturdy ranch house sat against the pale morning sky, a thin ribbon of smoke coming from its chimney. Living up there all alone like some kind of hermit. No wife, no family, no company but cattle and dust. I pity him. I truly do. The other women followed her gaze obediently. Bessie Hargrove nodded in solemn agreement. Mildred Estes made a sound in the back of her throat that could have meant anything. Clara Potts, who was 17 and still believed everything Adelaide said without chewing it over first, actually pressed her hand to her heart as though the sight of the distant smoke was a thing to mourn. "Tobias Ford," said Bessie, because somebody had to name him. "He came to Caldwell Creek, 2 years ago now, bought that land from old Harlan's estate and has barely come down from that hill since." "He comes to town," Mildred offered in mild defense. "For supplies," Adelaide said. "Not for company. There is a difference." She looked back at the smoke on the hill with an expression that she had arranged to resemble compassion, but was really quite close to satisfaction. A man like that, choosing to live like that, something must be deeply wrong with him. "I pity him," she repeated, and the repetition made it sound more like a verdict than a feeling. She had not met Tobias Ford. She had seen him once at a distance, crossing the far end of Main Street with a pair of saddlebags over one shoulder, his hat pulled low, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who had somewhere he would rather be. She had formed her opinion from that single glimpse, from the rumors that drifted through town the way dust drifted through a cracked window pane, quietly, steadily, until you looked around and everything was covered in it. What Adelaide did not know, and what she had not bothered to investigate before forming her opinion, was a great deal. She did not know that Tobias Ford had come to Caldwell Creek, specifically because the land on that hill was the finest grazing land in the county, and he had spent 3 years saving the money to buy it. She did not know that he had grown up the son of a poor farmer in Missouri, and had worked cattle drives from the age of 16, sleeping under open sky and counting stars until he knew their patterns the way other men knew their prayers. She did not know that he was 28 years old and built like a man who had spent his entire life doing things that required the full use of his body, or that beneath the silence he carried around himself like a second coat, there was a mind that had read every book in the traveling library that came through town and could discuss Dickens with a thoroughness that would have startled Adelaide considerably. She did not know any of this, but she told everyone she pitied him, and in a town like Caldwell Creek, telling everyone something was nearly as powerful as making it true. Adelaide herself was 23, the daughter of the late Reverend Arthur Finley, who had died of fever 4 years prior and left her the house on Sycamore Lane, a modest inheritance, and a reputation for moral authority that she had been trading on ever since. She was pretty in the way that certain landscapes are pretty striking at first look, but somehow cooler the longer you stood in them. Her hair was the color of dark honey, and she wore it pinned with the exact propriety that the year 1874 demanded. She had turned down 2 proposals in the past 18 months, which the town considered either admirable independence or reckless foolishness depending on who you asked. She had her opinions about things. She had them loudly, and she had them often, and she kept them neatly arranged, like the preserves on her pantry shelf, each one labeled, each one where it was supposed to be. The morning she first actually spoke to Tobias Ford was not a morning of her choosing. It was late April, 3 weeks after she had made her declaration outside the dry goods store, and Adelaide was riding her bay mare, Nutmeg, along the road that curved up past the lower pastures, toward the ridge where the wildflowers grew in such abundance that she sometimes took the longer route just to see them. It was an indulgence she allowed herself on Sunday afternoons when the whole town was resting, and the world was quiet enough to breathe in properly. She had rounded the bend where the old cottonwood leaned over the creek bed when Nutmeg shied hard to the left, and Adelaide, whose attention had been somewhere above the treetops, was entirely unprepared for it. She came off the saddle with a startled gasp that was not entirely dignified, hit the soft bank of the creek with a thump that knocked the breath from her lungs, and sat for a moment in the mud with her skirts around her and her dignity somewhere upstream. Nutmeg, having spooked at what turned out to be a jackrabbit, stood 6 feet away looking mildly apologetic. "Are you hurt?" The voice came from above her, and Adelaide looked up to find a man on horseback, having apparently come around the bend from the other direction at precisely the wrong moment to witness her humiliation. He had already dismounted before the question finished leaving his mouth, dropping from his saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than off it, and was crouching at the edge of the bank looking down at her, with an expression that was carefully arranged to contain no amusement whatsoever, which told her immediately that he was suppressing a great deal of it. He was wearing a dark canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the coolness of the afternoon, a battered hat, and the general appearance of a man who had been doing actual physical labor at some point in the recent past. His face was angular and tanned to the color of the landscape, and his eyes, which were a light, almost startling shade of gray, were looking at her with an attention that felt unnerving in a way she could not immediately explain. "I am perfectly fine," Adelaide said, which was not entirely true because her left elbow was aching considerably, but she was not about to report that to a stranger. "You landed fairly hard," he said. He extended a hand down the bank toward her. His hand was large, calloused, and entirely steady. She considered refusing it. It would have been the more dignified choice, since accepting help from a stranger while sitting in a creek bed was not how she had imagined her Sunday afternoon proceeding. But the bank was slick with spring mud, and the practical part of her, which she did not always listen to, but which was always there, pointed out that refusing the hand would result in a second fall that would be even less graceful than the first. She took his hand. He pulled her up the bank with a single steady motion, not making any sort of production of it, and when she was on solid ground he released her hand immediately and stepped back to give her room to compose herself, which she appreciated more than she was prepared to admit. "Your elbow," he said, looking at her left arm. "It's fine. There's blood on your sleeve." She looked down. There was, in fact, a small dark stain spreading at the elbow of her good Sunday riding jacket, which meant the fall had been harder than she'd acknowledged. She pressed her lips together. "I have a medical kit at the house," he said. "It's not far." She looked at him properly then, and the recognition landed in her chest with a small, unwelcome thud. She had seen this man once before at the far end of Main Street. She had formed an opinion about him from that single viewing and had shared that opinion extensively with the women of Caldwell Creek. "You're Tobias Ford," she said. Something moved behind those gray eyes. "I am," he said. "And you are Adelaide Finley." She felt, though she could not have explained why, as though she had been caught doing something she ought not to have been doing. "You know me." "It's a small town," he said simply. He was already moving to retrieve Nutmeg's reins from where the mare had ambled, guilt apparently having driven her to stand near a patch of good spring grass. He handed the reins to Adelaide without ceremony. "The house is 10 minutes up the trail if you'd rather not ride. Your elbow should be cleaned out. Creek mud in an open cut is a recipe for infection. It was so matter-of-fact, so entirely devoid of any attempt to charm her or impress her, that Adelaide found herself walking up the trail beside him before she had made a conscious decision to do so. She told herself it was purely practical. She told herself the same thing 3 more times on the walk up, which should have told her something. The ranch house on the hill was not what she had expected, though she had been honest enough with herself in the following weeks to acknowledge that she had not known what she expected because she had never actually looked at it carefully. It was modest in size but well built, the kind of structure that spoke of a man who understood that quality was more important than appearance. There were window boxes with young plants in them, not flowers, but herbs, rosemary and sage by the smell of them. And the yard was not particularly tidy, but it was organized in the way that working spaces are when the person using them knows exactly where everything is. A large gray dog got up from the porch steps as they approached and regarded Adelaide with the dignified assessment of an animal that takes its responsibilities seriously. "That's Anchor," Tobias said. "He's friendlier than he looks." Anchor proved this by pushing his large head against Adelaide's free hand, in a way that was clearly a demand for acknowledgement rather than a request for it. She scratched behind his ears without thinking about it, which seemed to satisfy him. Inside, the house was clean and spare and full of books. She noticed this last thing most of all. There were books on a shelf along the entire length of one wall, organized in a manner that suggested regular use rather than display. A battered armchair sat near the window at an angle that would catch the best of the afternoon light. There was a stone fireplace with a coffee pot sitting on the iron rack above low coals, and the whole place smelled of coffee and wood smoke and leather, and something else she could not name that was simply the smell of a life being lived in a space. He indicated the chair by the window and went to the shelf below the books where a tin medical kit sat with the easy accessibility of something that gets regular use. He cleaned the cut on her elbow with the competence of a man who had dealt with worse injuries than this in places where a doctor was 3 days' ride away, which, as she would later learn, was precisely his qualification. "This will sting," he said, which was the only warning he offered before applying carbolic solution, and it did indeed sting, and she did not make a sound about it, which seemed to register with him as something worth noting. They did not speak much while he worked. The quiet between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the particular quiet of 2 people who are paying more attention to each other than they are letting on. "Thank you," she said when he had bandaged her elbow with a neatness that surprised her. "You're welcome." He put the medical kit away. He did not ask her to leave, but he also did not make any move to suggest she should stay, which left the decision entirely to her. She looked at the books on the wall. "You've read all of these, most of them twice." She stood and crossed to the shelf and ran her finger along the spines without thinking about it, reading the titles: Dickens, Emerson, a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick, Darwin's On the Origin of Species, which made her pause, a collection of Spanish poetry that seemed slightly out of place beside the cattle management manual, a Bible well used, 3 volumes of American history. "You're surprised," he said. He was not accusatory about it. He was simply observing. "A little," she admitted, and honesty was not her most practiced virtue, so the admission cost her something. "People usually are," he said. And then, without any particular inflection, he said, "I hear you pity me." The room felt, briefly, like it had contracted around her. She turned from the bookshelf and faced him. He was leaning against the kitchen table with his arms crossed over his chest, and his expression was not angry. It was something more uncomfortable than angry. It was patient. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for a thing to arrive and was unsurprised that it had. "I spoke out of turn," she said, "because the only thing worse than having been wrong and unkind was being caught having been wrong and unkind and then lying about it." "You spoke out of ignorance," he said. "That's a different thing. People say things about what they don't know. It's a common enough habit. It's still wrong." "Yes," he agreed, "it is." She expected him to make more of it, to press the advantage. Instead, he simply went and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot and set one on the table near her without asking if she wanted it, which was either presumptuous or perceptive depending on how you looked at it. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and found that she was not particularly inclined to leave. They talked for an hour, which neither of them had planned. She found out about Missouri and the cattle drives and the 3 years of saving. He found out about the Reverend and Sycamore Lane and the preserves. She told him more than she intended to, which was something he had a way of achieving without appearing to try, a way of asking questions that were so simple and direct that answering them felt natural, like walking through an open door. When she finally rose to leave, the light through the window had shifted to the long gold of late afternoon, and Anchor had at some point during the conversation installed himself at her feet in a manner that suggested he had adopted her. "I owe you an apology," she said at the door. "A proper one. You don't owe me anything," he said, "but if you want to offer one, I won't turn it away." "Then I am sorry, Tobias Ford. I made you into something I needed you to be without asking who you actually are." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that saw rather too much. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years," he said. She rode Nutmeg back down the hill in the fading light with her bandaged elbow and her rearranged notions, and she did not tell a single person where she had been. She came back the following Sunday. She told herself it was to return the handkerchief she had used to wipe her hands, which she had left on his kitchen table. This was, technically, true. It was also transparently insufficient as a reason, and she knew it, and she came anyway. He was in the yard when she arrived, repairing a section of fence with the focused attention he brought to everything physical, and he straightened when he saw her and took off his hat in a gesture that was courteous without being theatrical. "I brought your handkerchief," she said. "I see that," he said. Anchor came barreling around the side of the house at a speed that seemed to contradict his usual dignity and planted himself in front of her expectantly. "He remembered you," Tobias said, with what Adelaide was beginning to recognize as the faint lightening around his eyes that constituted his version of a smile. "He seems pleased about it," she said, and bent to greet the dog. They walked the fence line together while he finished the repairs, and she found herself holding tools and passing things when he needed them in a completely unplanned and natural manner, as though she had been doing this for years rather than 20 minutes. He explained what he was doing and why without talking down to her, which she appreciated. She asked questions that were genuine rather than polite. The conversation moved from the fence to the herd, to the particular challenges of the land on the hill, which drained differently than the flat pastures below and required a different approach to water management, and she was surprised to find that she was genuinely interested. "You love this land," she said, not as a question. He was driving a post and he paused with the mallet in his hands and looked out across the hillside with an expression that was more open than anything she had seen from him yet. "I do," he said. "I worked for other men's land for 10 years. Having my own, it's different in a way that's hard to put words to." "You don't have to put words to it," she said. He looked at her as though that had surprised him. "No," he agreed. "I suppose I don't." Over the next several Sundays she came back, and then she started coming on Saturday afternoons as well. And then on a Wednesday, when she happened to be riding past his lower pasture, she stopped to tell him about the traveling library wagon that would be coming through town in a fortnight because she had been thinking he would want to know about it, which was not a Sunday and not a Saturday, and which meant that something had shifted without either of them having formally announced it. The town noticed, because the town always noticed. Bessie Hargrove was the first to say something directly, which she did on a Thursday morning at the dry goods store while Adelaide was examining bolts of fabric. "You've been going up that hill," Bessie said, with the precision of someone who has been waiting to deliver this information at exactly the right moment. "I have," Adelaide said, not looking up from the fabric. "People are talking." "People are always talking," Adelaide said. "It is the primary industry of Caldwell Creek." Bessie pressed on. "You said you pitied him, everyone heard you, and now you're spending your Sunday afternoons up there. It seems contradictory, Adelaide said, looking up now. Yes. I was wrong about him, Bessie. I formed an opinion about a man I had never spoken to, and I was wrong. I am not the first person to be wrong, and I suspect I won't be the last. Bessie opened her mouth and closed it again. Mildred Estes, who was 3 feet away examining dried goods with unconvincing casualness, made a small sound. He is a good man, Adelaide said, and the evenness of her voice when she said it was a new kind of evenness, not the practiced composure of a woman performing certainty, but the quieter steadiness of a woman who has arrived somewhere and knows it. She did not say anything more on the subject. She paid for her fabric and went home and sat in her parlor on Sycamore Lane and thought about the look on Tobias Ford's face that afternoon 2 weeks ago when she had asked him about Missouri, and how he had gone quiet for a moment and then told her simply, without drama, that his mother had died when he was 12 and his father had turned sour with grief, and that by 16, the wide open country of the cattle trails had felt like the only place where a person could breathe without bumping into someone else's pain. She thought about the fact that when she had told him her father had died of fever and left her alone, and that she had organized herself around the business of being capable because it was the only way she knew to manage fear, he had not said anything immediately. He had sat with it for a long moment, and then he had said, "Yes, I know that particular way of managing things." And she had felt, for the first time in several years, the peculiar comfort of being understood by someone who was not trying to fix you. She came up the hill the following Saturday with a jar of her apple preserves and left it on his table while he made coffee, and when he tasted them that afternoon and said nothing except, "These are good," which was 2 words in Tobias Ford's economy of expression and constituted high praise, she felt a warm pleasure move through her that had very little to do with the preserves. May became June. The Texas summer settled in with its full weight, and the air above the hills shimmered and danced in the afternoon heat. Adelaide took to arriving earlier on her Saturday visits to avoid the worst of the midday heat, and Tobias began to have lemonade made when she arrived, which was a small and practical thing that nonetheless lodged itself somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She met his ranch hand, a quiet older man named Rupert, who had been with Tobias since the second cattle drive he'd ever worked, and who had followed him to Caldwell Creek because, as he explained to Adelaide with a dry matter-of-factness that she liked enormously, he was too old to work for anybody worse. She brought books when she came, the ones she thought would interest him, and he returned them with notes tucked inside not elaborate annotations but single phrases, sometimes just a question mark next to a passage, that invited conversation. They talked about the books the way people talk about things they love, not performing appreciation, but genuinely exchanging it, disagreeing sometimes, which turned out to be more interesting than agreeing. It was on a Saturday in late June that she arrived to find him not at the house but in the far pasture, and Rupert gestured her in the right direction with the unconcerned ease of a man who has stopped keeping track of the comings and goings of a particular visitor because they have become expected. She found him sitting on the hillside in the shade of a live oak, not working, which was unusual enough that she registered it. He was looking out across the valley below where Caldwell Creek lay in the afternoon haze, its water glinting where it caught the light, the town itself small and manageable from this elevation. She sat down beside him without being invited and without waiting to be told whether she was welcome, because somewhere between April and June she had stopped needing that kind of permission. "Something on your mind?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass below them with a sound like running water. "I got a letter," he said, "from a land agent. There's a man in San Antonio who wants this hill." She felt a cold thing move through her chest. "It's your land." "It is," he said. "But the offer is considerable, and there have been," he paused, "there have been some difficulties lately." The herd lost 7 head to a disease last month that I haven't been able to identify. Rupert thinks it's the water in the lower draw, and I think he's probably right, which means I need to reroute the water, which means money I don't currently have. Adelaide looked at the side of his face. He was not asking her for anything. He was simply telling her something honest, the way he always did, without wrapping it in anything to make it easier to hear. "You won't sell," she said. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was quieter and more searching than his usual look. "How do you know that?" "Because you told me once that you worked for other men's land for 10 years, she said, "and that having your own was different in a way that was hard to put words to. You're not going to sell this land to Tobias Ford, not to a man in San Antonio or anyone else." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that she had stopped finding unnerving and now simply found honest. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." "Good," she said. "Then let's think about the water problem." What followed was a 2-hour conversation that covered water sources, drainage patterns, the cost of materials, and Rupert's memory of a similar problem on a ranch in the Texas Hill Country. 20 years before that had been solved with a gravity-fed diversion system that was simple to build and required only the cost of labor, which Tobias and Rupert could provide themselves. Adelaide had not come to that conversation with any particular knowledge of hydrology, but she had an excellent practical mind and a talent for asking the right question at the right time. And by the time the sun was dropping toward the hill line, they had a workable plan sketched in the dirt beside the oak tree. He walked her down to where she had tied Nutmeg that afternoon, and at the bottom of the trail, when she was already in the saddle, he looked up at her and said, "You're the only person who has ever helped me think through a problem without trying to solve it for me first." She looked down at him from Nutmeg's back, and the evening light was doing something golden and generous with everything it touched, and she felt the words she was not yet ready to say move through her like a current. "I'll come up on Wednesday," she said instead, "to help with the first section of the diversion." She saw the corner of his mouth lift in the slow, careful way of a man who does not smile easily, and therefore means it absolutely when he does. "I'll make coffee," he said. She rode back down toward Caldwell Creek in the warm evening, and she let herself feel, privately and without quite yet acknowledging it in words, that she had been wrong about something far more significant than the character of Tobias Ford. She had been wrong about the whole shape of a thing. She had looked up at that hill and seen loneliness and called it pitiable, when in fact what was up that hill was something that had been quietly waiting for the right kind of company, the kind that didn't need you to perform yourself differently than you were. Wednesday came. She arrived with her working clothes on under her riding coat, which told Rupert everything he needed to know without a word being exchanged, and he nodded at her with the respect one competent person offers another. They worked on the diversion channel for 3 Wednesdays running. It was hard, practical work digging and hauling and setting the diversion boards, and Adelaide did her share of it without complaint. And at the end of the first Wednesday, she was dirty and sore, and had never in her adult life felt so entirely and satisfyingly useful. She helped Rupert cook dinner that first evening, refusing to leave before the work was properly put away, and the 3 of them ate at the kitchen table as the sun went down, and the hill filled with the sound of crickets. At the end of that dinner, Rupert looked at her and then looked at Tobias and said, "Good woman," in the tone of a final verdict being delivered, and then excused himself to go to his quarters, leaving a quality of silence behind him that Adelaide found she needed to do something with quickly or it would become something else. "Your hand," she said, reaching across the table to take hold of it without planning to. He had cut his palm on the edge of a diversion board that afternoon, and the cut had been cleaned and wrapped, but the wrapping had come loose during dinner. She rewrapped it with a strip of clean cloth from her pocket, her fingers working with practiced efficiency, and she was not looking at his face until she was done, and then she was, and the look on it stopped her breath with its completeness. It was not a look she had seen from him before. It was entirely open. It was the face of a man who has run out of ways to be carefully arranged. She did not let go of his hand. "Adelaide," he said very quietly. "Yes," she said, and she meant it as an answer to something he had not yet asked but which was entirely clear. He turned his hand so that it held hers rather than the other way around, and the warmth of his grip moved all the way up her arm and settled somewhere central and stayed. They did not kiss that evening. They simply sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight with their hands together and talked until it was past proper leaving time. And when she finally went to the door and he followed to see her out, he stood on the porch with Anchor at his side and watched her ride down the hill, and she did not look back until she reached the first bend in the trail. And when she did, he was still there in the lamplight with his hand raised. She rode the rest of the way home in a state that was not quite happiness and not quite peace, but was something that contained elements of both and something else besides that she could not name yet. And when she got home, she sat in her parlor for a long time in the dark before she finally went to bed. July arrived with its full, brutal Texas heat and brought with it, among other things, two developments that changed the shape of things considerably. The first was that Silas Greer, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, and had been watching Tobias Ford's small but well-managed ranch with the speculative attention of a man who collects things, sent a representative to make an offer for the lower pastures. The offer was structured cleverly, not for all the land but for just the lower section, which sounded reasonable until you understood that without the lower pastures the hill land had no access to the main water source and became essentially worthless. It was the kind of offer that looked like a favor and was in fact a trap, and the representative who delivered it was smooth-voiced and expensively dressed and clearly accustomed to dealing with people who didn't read the fine print. Tobias had read the fine print, because Tobias always read the fine print. He declined the offer with a brevity that the representative apparently found bewildering. The second development was that Adelaide, in the process of helping Tobias draft a formal written response to Silas Greer's representative that would make the refusal entirely legally clear, let slip to Bessie Hargrove that she had been spending rather a lot of time on the hill recently, and that this was not a thing she had any intention of stopping. She had not planned to say this. It came out in response to Bessie's inquiry, delivered with the gentle persistence of a person who has been appointed to check in on community morals, about whether Adelaide was being careful. "Careful about what?" Adelaide asked. "Your reputation," Bessie said. "People are talking about how often you're up at that ranch." "Then they're well occupied," Adelaide said, "and I am perfectly fine." Bessie looked at her with the intensity of a woman taking inventory. "You've changed," she said, "since April." "I've corrected some mistakes," Adelaide said. "That's one way to put it," Bessie said, and the way she said it suggested that she found this correction more significant than Adelaide was letting on. She was not wrong, but Adelaide was not ready to discuss it with Bessie yet. There were things she had not yet said to Tobias, and she was not going to discuss them with anyone else before she had said them to him. The opportunity came on a Saturday in mid-July when a thunderstorm swept in from the west with the sudden theatrical velocity of a Texas summer storm, and caught them both in the far pasture where they had been checking the repaired diversion channel, which was working beautifully, and had already prevented the loss of a single additional head of cattle. They ran for the shelter of the old stone outbuilding near the east fence, which was the closest cover, and got inside just as the rain hit in earnest, rattling on the stone roof like 1,000 small arguments happening simultaneously. They stood in the doorway watching the rain pour off the roof in silver curtains, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him along her side, the smell of him, soap and sun and honest work entirely familiar now in a way that felt like home. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to tell you something." She looked at the rain rather than at him because it was easier to begin that way. "When I first made those comments about you, about pitying you, it wasn't entirely about you. I think it was about me." He was quiet and she continued. "I was afraid of the kind of life you were living, the solitude of it, the sufficiency of it. living up on that hill and needing nothing from anyone. She paused. I think it frightened me because I admired it and I didn't know how to admire something I couldn't have, so I called it pitiable instead. The rain pounded on the roof. She could feel him listening with his whole attention, which was something he did and which she had come to understand was rare and precious. Why couldn't you have it? He asked. I thought solitude and loneliness were the same thing, she said. I know now they're not. He turned from the doorway and she turned at the same moment, and they were facing each other in the gray light that the storm threw through the door, and his expression was the one she had seen at the kitchen table, open, unguarded, entirely real. You are not a woman I pity, he said. You are the only woman I have ever met who made me feel that my life on this hill was worth inviting someone into. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of his beard under her palm, and he covered her hand with his in the same way he had held it at the kitchen table, and then he kissed her with the particular kind of care that a man exercises when he is kissing something he intends to keep. The storm lasted an hour. They stood in the doorway of the stone outbuilding as the rain eased to a gentle drumming, and talked the way they always talked, about everything and nothing, about the land and the books and the future and the past, except that now his arm was around her shoulders, and she was leaning into his side with a trust that she had not given to another person in 4 years. Since the morning her father had died, and she had organized herself around the business of being capable, and had not quite found her way back to softness, until a muddy bank by a creek in April had knocked it back into her. He walked her back to Nutmeg in the clearing rain, the air clean and electric-smelling, the grass bright with it. I would like to court you properly, he said, which was simple and direct and entirely him. If you're willing. I'm willing, she said, though I have to tell you, Tobias Ford, that this courtship began some time ago without either of us officially declaring it. The smile came fully this time, transforming his face in the way that she had been waiting to see again since the first time she'd caught it. I suppose it did, he said. She rode home in the rain-washed evening, and this time she looked back twice. August brought the courtship into daylight, and Caldwell Creek, which had been observing the situation with the absorbed attention of a town that takes its entertainments where it finds them, adjusted its narrative accordingly. The women who had stood outside the dry goods store in April and nodded along with Adelaide's declaration about the hermit on the hill now, had the more interesting and satisfying story of watching that declaration unravel, and most of them were generous enough to be genuinely pleased about it, which said something kind about most of them. Tobias came down the hill for church on the first Sunday of August, which he had not been doing regularly, and sat beside Adelaide in the pew she had occupied alone since her father's death, and the resulting whisper that moved through the congregation before the opening hymn was like wind through dry grass, swift, inevitable, and impossible to suppress. After church, Adelaide introduced him to people she had been describing for years, and found that the descriptions she had given, capable, good-natured, well-read, bone-deep honest, were being tested in real time against the actual man, and were, satisfyingly, passing that test with room to spare. Rupert came down with him, and was claimed almost immediately by 3 different old men who had served on the same cattle drives in their youth, and they stood outside the church in the hot August morning, talking with the enthusiasm of people who have found their native language after years of translation. Silas Greer came to speak to Tobias that same morning, not the representative this time but Greer himself, a large, prosperous man in his 50s with a salesman's smile, and the eyes of a man who has been adding things up for a long time. Adelaide stood at Tobias's side for the conversation, which Greer had not anticipated, and when Greer made a fresh offer for the lower pastures that was dressed up as a friendly neighborly arrangement, she asked 3 very precise questions about the water rights clause that were so accurate and specific that Greer's smile flickered for a moment before he recovered it. He declined the offer again with the same brevity as before and walked away with Adelaide on his arm, and she felt his hand press hers briefly against his side in acknowledgement, which was more intimate and more satisfying than a compliment would have been. "Where did you learn about water rights clauses?" he asked. "My father was a minister, not a lawyer," she said, "but he settled more disputes than any justice of the peace in this county, and water was the thing people fought about most. I listened." "I'm glad you did," he said. "So am I," she said. September arrived, and with it the harvest work that occupied every hand on every ranch in the county. Adelaide came up the hill as often as she could, and spent most of those visits doing something practical: cooking, mending, helping with the accounts, which she had found were kept with perfect accuracy, but not always in the clearest order. A problem she solved in 2 evenings with a ledger system that even Rupert agreed was an improvement. On a September evening, when the air had finally stopped being murderous and had become merely warm, they sat on the porch after supper and watched the stars come out over the valley. An anchor was between them, with his head on Adelaide's knee, and Tobias said, without looking away from the sky, "I have been thinking about asking you something." Adelaide was quiet. "I want to be careful about how I ask it," he said, "because it matters and I don't want to get it wrong." "You can ask me anything," she said. "You have never once gotten it wrong." He turned and looked at her in the early starlight, and he said, "Adelaide Finley, I was alone on this hill for 2 years, and I was not unhappy, because I did not know what I was missing. And then you came up the trail with mud on your riding jacket and blood on your sleeve and more pride than sense. And you told me the most honest apology anyone had ever given me. And you sat in my chair and looked at my books, and you have been making this life better in every way I can think of ever since. I love you. I would like you to be my wife if you'll have me and this hill." The stars continued their unconcerned progress across the Texas sky. Below them, Caldwell Creek lay in its lamplight, quiet and small and very distant. "I told everyone I pitied you," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I was a fool." "You were wrong," he said. "There's a difference, and you corrected it, which is the important part." She looked at his face in the starlight, the angular jaw, the careful gray eyes, the particular quality of his attention that had always felt like being genuinely seen, and she said, "Yes, I'll have you and this hill." He kissed her under the October stars that were arriving early, as they sometimes did in Texas. An anchor pushed his head against them both in what was clearly a bid for acknowledgement, and she laughed against Tobias's mouth in a way she had not laughed in a very long time. They told Rupert first, because it seemed right, and Rupert made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained all the elements of one, and said, "Well, it's about time," and poured 3 glasses of the whiskey he kept in his quarters for significant occasions. They told the town on Sunday. Bessie Hargrove, to her considerable credit, was the first person to hug Adelaide, and she did it with the genuine warmth of a woman who can say, "I saw this coming," and choose to say, "I'm so happy for you," instead. Clara Potts, who had pressed her hand to her heart outside the dry goods store in April over the tragedy of the smoke on the hill, now pressed her hand to her heart over the romance of the story, which was a more appropriate use of the gesture. Mildred Est said, "Well," which was her comprehensive verdict on most situations. Silas Greer, upon hearing the news, sent a congratulatory note that Adelaide considered an olive branch and Tobias considered a revised strategy, and they were both probably right. They married on a Saturday in October 1874, in the church where Adelaide's father had preached for 20 years, and where his name was still carved above the door. Rupert stood as witness for Tobias. Bessie Hargrove stood as witness for Adelaide. The minister, a young man named Reverend Colton, who had replaced Adelaide's father 3 years prior, and who was slightly afraid of her, conducted the ceremony with great seriousness, which they both appreciated. Adelaide wore a dress she had made herself from the blue fabric she had been examining at the dry goods store on the morning Bessie had asked her about her reputation, which she had chosen for no particular reason at the time, and which now seemed, looking back, like the kind of coincidence that is probably not a coincidence at all. When Tobias saw her at the end of the church aisle, he made no dramatic display. He simply looked at her with the full weight of his attention and the slow, complete smile that was his at its most open. And she walked to him through the warm October light and took his hands and felt, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The vows they spoke were the ordinary words of the 1874 Episcopal ceremony, the same words that hundreds of thousands of people had spoken before them and would speak after, and yet they sat in the air of that small Texas church with a particular gravity, because the people speaking them were people who had earned them, who had come to them through honesty and correction and actual knowledge of each other, rather than through assumption or convenience or the management of appearances. "With my worldly goods I thee endow," Tobias said, and looked at her as he said it, and she knew he meant the hill and the land and the books on the shelf and the gray dog and the herb boxes in the window and the coffee in the morning and the stars at night and all of it, all the small and daily pieces of a life being shared. They signed the register. They walked out into the October morning as husband and wife, and the town of Caldwell Creek was on the church steps with the warm, slightly proprietary approval of a community that has watched a thing develop and feels entitled to some credit for the outcome. Adelaide Ford stood on the church steps beside her husband and thought about the morning in April when she had looked up at the smoke on the hill and said the words that would prove to be the least true thing she had ever said in her life. She thought about how the most significant turns in a story often begin with the moment when you are most confidently wrong. The reception was held in the town square, with tables borrowed from every house on Main Street and food contributed from every kitchen in the county, because that was how Caldwell Creek did things, all at once, all together, with an excess of generosity that was sometimes its best quality. There was a fiddle player and dancing, and Adelaide danced with a lightness that surprised people who had always considered her more dignified than festive, and Tobias danced with her in the careful, deliberate way of a man who did not grow up dancing, but was paying very close attention to doing it correctly, and the combination worked better than either would have predicted. Rupert danced with Bessie Hargrove, which nobody had anticipated but which seemed to suit everyone involved. When the evening was done and the stars were out, and the wagon was loaded with the gifts and practical necessities that the town had provided with its characteristic generous excess, Tobias helped Adelaide up onto the wagon seat, and they drove back up the hill in the October dark with the valley falling away below them, and the stars overhead and anchor running alongside, until his legs gave out, and he accepted the indignity of being hauled up onto the wagon bed, where he put his head on Adelaide's knee and went promptly to sleep. She looked back once at the lights of Caldwell Creek in the valley below, the small gold windows, the steady lamp on the church corner, the dark ribbon of the creek catching starlight, and then she looked forward at the trail ahead and the house on the hill growing larger and more familiar as they approached. It was her home now, every piece of it. The winter of 1874 was cold and dry, and Adelaide spent it learning the full rhythms of life on the hill, which were different from the rhythms of Sycamore Lane in ways that were sometimes harder and consistently more interesting. The mornings were early before dawn, because the cattle needed to be checked and fed before anything else, and she went out with Tobias in the gray pre-dawn cold without being asked, because that was what the work required. She learned to read the weather from the west, which was a skill she had never needed on Sycamore Lane, and which Tobias taught her with the patient thoroughness of someone who considered it important knowledge. She learned the names and personalities of every animal on the ranch, which Rupert found quietly amusing and Tobias found quietly delightful. She brought her books up from Sycamore Lane, which doubled the collection on the shelf, and created an organizational challenge that she and Tobias spent an entire Sunday working through, moving books and arguing their respective merits with the cheerful vehemence of two people who care about the same things from different angles. In the end, they arranged them by subject with some concessions to pure personal preference, and the resulting system was better than either of their individual approaches would have been. She rented out the house on Sycamore Lane to the new schoolteacher who had been rooming above the saloon, and found the arrangement unsuitable, which solved two problems at once and provided a steady small income that Adelaide directed into the ranch accounts, specifically into the water infrastructure fund that she and Tobias had been building since the summer. She learned to make the particular cornbread that Rupert liked, which required a cast iron skillet and a very specific amount of bacon fat, and the willingness to accept that you would never get it quite right until the 15th attempt, which she reached in January and which Rupert acknowledged with the highest accolade in his repertoire, a second helping without being asked. She learned the silence of the hill at night, which was different from town silence. It was fuller, more alive. Coyotes in the draws, wind in the live oaks, cattle shifting in the pens, Anchor's occasional commentary on things passing in the dark outside. She had thought she would find it lonely, this much quiet with this much sky. Instead, she found it was the opposite, a place where you could hear yourself think without the town's continuous commentary drowning out your own voice. She and Tobias talked in the evenings by the fire with a depth and regularity that she had not experienced with another person in her life, not even her father, with whom she had been deeply close. They talked about the books they were reading and about the history of the land they were standing on, and about what it meant that the Comanche who had once ranged this entire territory had been pushed off it by force within living memory, which was a thing Tobias thought about with a seriousness that she respected, and which she had, before coming to know him, not thought about at all. He told her what he knew of it from men he had worked with on the trail who had spoken of what they had seen, and what he knew from the books, and what he felt about it, which was a complicated and honest feeling that she did not fully share yet but was beginning to understand better. They were not perfect with each other. She had a temper that she had always managed with social grace rather than actual self-examination, and on the hill there was no society to perform good management for, and she discovered that, without that structure, she sometimes said sharp things before she had thought them through. He had a way of going quiet in difficult moments that looked like withdrawal but was actually thinking, and she had to learn the difference, which took several months and one significant misunderstanding that required them both to sit down and speak plainly about what they were actually doing. That conversation, which happened on a gray February afternoon with snow threatening the west window, was one of the most difficult and most important conversations she had ever had with another person. She told him that when he went quiet she felt dismissed, which was the fear underneath the sharpness, and he told her that when she said sharp things, he understood them as the end of a conversation rather than the middle of one, which was why he went quiet, not because he was withdrawing but because he was waiting. Once they had named these things correctly, the pattern stopped being problems and became simply things to be navigated, which is what all patterns between two people eventually are. By spring of 1875, Adelaide was carrying their first child, which she determined with the practical certainty of a woman who knows her own body, and confirmed with the physician who came through Caldwell Creek on his quarterly round, a sensible man named Dr. Abrams who shook her hand rather than patting it, which she appreciated. She told Tobias on a morning in March when the first wildflowers were appearing on the hillside, and the light was doing its generously golden thing with the valley below. She had intended to find a particular moment for it, but the moment found her instead. They were simply walking the fence line together in the morning, checking for winter damage, and she stopped and told him. He stood very still for a moment, the way he did when something had reached the part of him that was underneath the careful arrangement of his expression. Then he put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her close her eyes. "A father," he said. It was barely audible, not really for her but for himself, settling the idea into the correct place. "A father," she confirmed. "In September, Dr. Abrams thinks." He held her there in the morning light with the wildflowers coming up around them and the cattle moving in the lower pasture, and Anchor investigating something in the grass nearby. And she felt the fullness of it, the completed shape of something that had begun with a fall from a horse, and an apology in a kitchen that still smelled of coffee and wood smoke. She wrote to Bessie that afternoon, and Bessie's response arrived 2 days later and was everything she would have expected from Bessie, which was warm and immediate and slightly overlong. Rupert, when they told him, said good, with the single-word finality that was his particular form of eloquence, and then went to build a crib without being asked, which was already half finished when Adelaide discovered it in the workshop, and which was, when completed, the most beautiful piece of furniture in the house. The summer of 1875 passed in the comfortable and demanding way of summers on a working ranch, complicated slightly by the increasing fact of Adelaide's condition, but never reduced to something manageable or small. She continued to do everything until the things she could no longer do gracefully became things she delegated with the same efficiency she brought to everything, dividing the work differently rather than stopping it. Silas Greer made a third approach in July, this time through a lawyer rather than a representative or himself, which suggested he was increasingly serious and increasingly irritated by the continued refusals. The letter was formally and cleverly worded, and suggested that there were questions about the original purchase of the land from the Harlan estate that might bear legal examination. Adelaide read the letter twice, set it down on the kitchen table with deliberate calm, and sat down to write a response that was so precise and so thoroughly referenced in its citations of Texas land law that the lawyer who received it apparently needed 3 days to formulate an adequate reply, during which the matter went quiet and then stayed quiet. "You could have been a lawyer," Tobias said when she told him about the response. "I could have been many things," she said, "but I am here." "Yes," he said. "You are." Greer's lawyer did not write again. Greer himself encountered Tobias at the grain merchant's in August and was, according to Rupert, who had been present, notably warmer in his manner than he had previously been, which Rupert attributed to the dawning recognition that the people on that hill were not going anywhere, and were also not the sort of people it was strategically wise to antagonize. Their son was born on a Tuesday in September 1875, which was almost exactly a year after the wedding, and almost exactly 18 months after Adelaide had sat outside the dry goods store and declared her pity for the man on the hill. He was born in the house on the hill with Dr. Abrams in attendance and Tobias waiting in the kitchen, with the focused, tightly controlled anxiety of a man who has absolute confidence in the people handling the situation, and absolutely no confidence in his ability to stand still. Adelaide, who had been determined to be practical about the whole process, was still practical about it, but was also willing to admit afterward that practical was not quite the word for the particular extremity of the experience. She was also willing to admit that it was the best thing that had ever happened to her, which was not practical at all, and was entirely true. They named him Arthur James Ford Arthur for her father, James for Tobias's, and he arrived in the world with dark hair and his father's gray eyes, already wide open and looking at everything, which Adelaide considered entirely appropriate. Rupert held him the day after he was born with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something irreplaceable, and looked at him for a long moment, and then looked up at Tobias and Adelaide with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way that Rupert very rarely permitted himself. "Arthur James," he said. "Arthur James," Tobias confirmed. Rupert nodded. He handed the baby back with the same careful deliberateness. "That's a good name," he said, which from Rupert was a complete and sufficient speech. The baptism was held in the church where Tobias and Adelaide had married, now with Arthur as the newest addition to its register. The Reverend Colton performed the ceremony. Bessie Hargrove and Rupert stood as godparents, which created an arrangement that Bessie and Rupert seemed entirely comfortable with, and which produced, in the years following, a quiet and dignified friendship between the two of them that involved regular Sunday dinners and the sharing of considerable opinions about the world, delivered at a volume that required some competition on both sides. Winter came again, and Adelaide nursed Arthur through the cold months in the chair by the fire that had been Tobias's reading chair and was now understood to be whoever needed it most. And in the evenings Tobias sat across from her and read aloud while she nursed, which was a habit that began accidentally and became the thing she looked forward to most in the day. He had a good reading voice, measured, expressive, not performative, and Arthur, who was broadly indifferent to literature at 4 months of age, seemed to find the vibration of it soothing in a way that was profoundly convenient. She wrote in a journal she had started at the beginning of the courtship, and which had grown to 3 volumes by Arthur's first winter, recording the days and seasons of the hill with the precise attention of someone who understands that ordinary life, faithfully observed, is the most extraordinary document there is. In the spring of 1876, she made a particular trip down to Caldwell Creek that had been sitting in the back of her mind for several months. She went to the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning, because the women who had stood with her on that April morning in 1874 were most likely to be there on a Tuesday, and she found Bessie and Mildred and 2 others from that morning, and she told them directly what she had been thinking. "I said something on this street 2 years ago that was unkind and born of ignorance," she said, "and I've wanted to say for a while that I know it was both of those things. Tobias Ford is the best man I have ever known. He was the best man I had ever known the morning I said those words. I just didn't know it yet. I thought you should all hear that." There was a silence that contained several different kinds of feeling all at once. Bessie said, "We already knew, Adelaide." "I know you did," Adelaide said, "but I needed to say it." Mildred Est said, "Well," which Adelaide was beginning to suspect was in fact a complete and carefully weighted statement rather than the conversational filler she had always assumed it was. She went home up the hill with Arthur on her back in the carrier that Rupert had made, the same weight of sky above her and the same wildflowers on the hillside, and the house at the top growing larger as she climbed, and the smoke from the chimney rising thin and straight in the morning air, and Tobias in the yard tending the horses with Anchor at his heels, looking up when he heard her approach and lifting his hand in the particular way that she had noticed the very first evening she had ridden back down the hill. She had thought about that gesture many times in the 2 years since, the economy of it, the completeness of it. A man who uses words carefully uses gestures the same way, and that raised hand meant everything it was possible for a raised hand to mean. She raised her own in return, and he smiled the full smile and came across the yard to take Arthur, who reached for him immediately with the absolute trust of an 8-month-old, who has never had a reason to question the reliability of the arms that hold him. She watched them together, her husband and her son in the April morning, the hill behind them green with spring, the valley below them gold with it. And she understood with the clarity that sometimes arrives when you stop looking for it, that the thing she had looked up at 2 years ago and called pitiable had been the beginning of the best story she would ever live. The years settled into themselves with the gentle, purposeful rhythm of a life that knows what it is. The ranch grew not quickly, because quick growth on contested land is fragile, but steadily, in the careful way of things that are built to last. The herd expanded. The water infrastructure was completed in its second phase in 1877, which required an additional 3 weeks of shared labor and produced a system that Dr. Abrams, who came to check on Adelaide during her second pregnancy and got a tour of the water diversion on the way, declared an impressive piece of practical engineering. Adelaide's second pregnancy was less comfortable than the first, which she accepted with the matter-of-fact tolerance of a woman who has decided that complaining about the unavoidable is a waste of energy that could be used elsewhere. She continued the ranch accounts and the journal and the lending of books throughout, and she delivered their second child, a daughter, in the summer of 1878 without the particular drama that had accompanied the arrival of Arthur. They named her Mary Eleanor Ford Eleanor for no one in particular, but simply because it sounded like itself, strong and complete. She arrived with Adelaide's coloring, the dark honey hair, and Tobias's gray eyes, and the combination on an infant was sufficiently startling that Dr. Abrams paused before proceeding, which Adelaide would have found more alarming if she hadn't been exhausted. Arthur, who was 2 3/4 and deeply committed to his own importance in the household, regarded his sister with the measured assessment of a person encountering something that might compete with him for resources, and then, with the sudden reversal of toddler logic, decided she was interesting and sat beside her with the proprietorial attention of a very small and not entirely reliable guardian. Rupert, who had by this point become so thoroughly interwoven with the life on the hill that the designation, ranch hand, no longer quite covered it, built a second crib. He built it slightly more ornately than the first, as though the experience of the first one had taught him something about what the work required. Caldwell Creek grew through the late 1870s as the territories opened further and the railroad expanded its reach across Texas. New people arrived, new businesses opened, new dynamics settled over the town like a fresh coat of paint that was not entirely different in color from the old one. Adelaide watched it happen from the hill with the perspective of someone who has found her elevation and has no particular need to descend into the middle of things, though she went down regularly enough to maintain the relationships that mattered and the practicalities that required town access. She taught Arthur to read by lamplight in the evenings using the same books that lined the wall of the house, and he took to it with an eagerness that she found immensely satisfying, and that Tobias watched with an expression of quiet pride that he made no attempt to conceal. Mary, who was 3 years behind her brother, watched these reading sessions with intense focus from her earliest months and began pointing at letters before she could say words, which nobody was particularly surprised by. In 1879, Tobias expanded the east pasture by purchasing an adjacent parcel of land from a family that was moving further west, which required a significant financial commitment, but which he had been planning and saving toward for 2 years. Adelaide had reviewed every calculation and had contributed the proceeds from 2 years of Sycamore Lane rental income, and the purchase came in on budget, and the expansion was complete before the spring planting season, which was exactly how they had planned it. Rupert turned 60 in 1879 and declined to make any sort of event out of it, but Adelaide made a cake and Tobias produced the bottle of Kentucky bourbon that he had been saving since their wedding year, and the four of them, Tobias and Adelaide and Rupert and Arthur, with Mary asleep in her crib in the bedroom, sat on the porch in the October evening and ate cake and drank bourbon and talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. "I'm getting old," Rupert said with the straightforwardness that was his most consistent feature. "You are," Tobias agreed. "I'd like to stay," Rupert said. "We'd like you to stay," Adelaide said, and she meant it entirely. Rupert nodded. The bourbon went around again. In the valley below, the lights of Caldwell Creek were coming on one by one in the early dark, and above them the stars were appearing with the patience they always brought, unhurried, occupying their stations in the sky as they had for longer than anyone looking up at them could meaningfully comprehend. Arthur came and leaned against his father's side in the way that children do when they are tired but do not want to admit it, and Tobias put his arm around his son with the naturalness of a man for whom physical affection has become, through practice and intention, as easy as breathing. Adelaide watched them from her chair with Rupert on her other side and felt the fullness of the evening pressing warmly against her from all directions. "Arthur," she said, "what do you see when you look down at the town?" He considered this with the seriousness that he brought to most questions. He was 4 years old and he already had his father's tendency toward careful consideration before speech. "Lights," he said, "and the creek." "And what do you see when you look up?" she asked. He looked up. "Stars," he said, "a lot of them." "Your father taught me that the stars have patterns," she said, And if you know the patterns, you always know where you are. Arthur looked up at the sky with the focused intensity of a boy storing information. "Which ones?" he asked, looking at Tobias. Tobias lifted his arm from around his son's shoulders and pointed up, and began to name them. The ones he had learned on cattle trails under open sky, counting them until he knew their patterns the way other men knew their prayers. The ones he had identified by lamplight in the books on the shelf. The ones that had guided him across 10 years of other people's land until he found his own. Adelaide listened to his voice in the October dark and looked at the lights of Caldwell Creek and thought about the distance between the woman who had stood outside the dry goods store in April 1874 with her well-arranged opinions and a particular kind of fear dressed up as compassion, and the woman sitting on this porch now with this family assembled around her. The distance was not measured in miles or years. It was measured in the number of times she had been willing to be wrong and admit it, and in the particular courage of walking up a hill towards something you had misunderstood, because the honest thing in the end is almost always the brave thing. She reached over and took Tobias's free hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he closed his fingers around hers without looking away from the stars he was naming for their son. And she thought that there was not a thing in the world, not a book or a sermon or a well-turned piece of wisdom, that had ever explained anything to her more thoroughly than the simple and complete truth of his hand holding hers. The years that followed were the years of a life lived fully in its own dimensions, not without difficulty, because no honest life is without difficulty, and the territory of the Texas Hill Country in the late 19th century provided a full measure of the challenges that the land and the time had to offer. There were dry years and wet years and cattle prices that dropped when the market was flooded and rose when it tightened. There was a fence war in 1883 when the barbed wire fencing that was transforming the range created a period of tension between cattlemen and sheepherders that ran through the whole county like a crack in dry earth. And Tobias navigated it with the steady pragmatism of a man who believes in property rights, without believing that property rights justify every action taken in their name. There was the year that Mary was 6 and fell from the oak tree on the east side of the hill and broke her arm, and the long weeks of her recovery in which she was spectacularly impatient and required the management of 3 adults and a large dog to keep from climbing things prematurely. There was the summer Rupert's health declined enough that Dr. Abrams came to the hill more than once and spoke to Tobias, and Adelaide with the straightforward honesty of a physician who respects his patients enough to tell them the truth. Rupert lived to be 67, which he achieved with characteristic determination, and he died in the winter of 1886 in his own bed in his own quarters on the hill that he had come to, because he was too old to work for anybody worse. He died with Adelaide holding one of his hands and Tobias holding the other, and Arthur and Mary sitting quietly in the doorway because it seemed wrong to be anywhere else, an anchor at the foot of the bed, in the position he had assumed upon Rupert's first day of weakness and had not voluntarily left since. He was buried on the hill, in the shade of the live oak on the east side where the view of the valley was the best, and the stone that marked the place was simple and said what needed to be said without excess. Bessie Hargrove came up the hill for the first time she had ever come up it, and she stood at the grave for a long time with her hands folded, and then she came inside and had coffee and sat for an hour with Adelaide and Tobias, and did not say anything particularly significant, but was entirely present in the way that the best people are when presence is what is required. Arthur was 10 that winter and had already begun to understand that there were things that happened in life that could not be organized or managed, and that the way you survived them was not by standing apart from them, but by letting the people who loved you stand with you through them. This was a thing his mother had taken 23 years to learn, and that his father had known from the beginning, and the fact that Arthur seemed to arrive at it earlier was a thing that Adelaide found both moving and clarifying. Mary was 7 and managed grief by putting it directly into her body and then walking it out, which meant that, for the weeks after Rupert's death, she spent more time outdoors than in, ranging the hill with Anchor at her heels, and returning in the evenings mud-stained and quieter and somehow more settled. Her father watched this with recognition, and her mother with a patience she had learned specifically to provide for the people who needed to process things by moving through them. Their third child, a second son named James William Ford James for the name they'd held back from Arthur's naming, William for Rupert, whose given name almost nobody had ever used, arrived in 1888, a full 11 years after Mary, which was not planned and was entirely welcomed. Tobias was 39 and Adelaide was 37, and they were perhaps more prepared for a new baby than they had been the first time, which made them simultaneously more competent and more aware of what was coming, a combination that was largely useful. James arrived with the dark hair and gray eyes that seemed to be the house standard, already established by Arthur and Mary before him, and he was a tranquil infant and a confident toddler, and from an early age showed a particular aptitude for animals that manifested as an ability to calm a spooked horse that grown men had given up on, which Tobias noticed and cultivated with the quiet intentionality of a father who pays attention. Arthur, at 11 when James was born, regarded his new brother with the evaluating eye of a person who has been the eldest long enough to have strong opinions about how things should be done, and then descended into a fondness for the infant that somewhat embarrassed him, and that he would have denied strenuously if anyone had brought it up directly. Mary, at 8, was entirely and immediately devoted, which surprised nobody. The 1890s arrived and Caldwell Creek had become, in the decades since Adelaide had stood outside the dry goods store, something substantially larger and more complicated than the town of her childhood. The railroad had brought new commerce and new people and new attitudes, some of which Adelaide found encouraging, and some of which she found troubling in ways she discussed with Tobias on the porch in the evenings, while the stars came out, and the valley below them glittered with more lights than it had possessed in 1874. Arthur, at 15, was already doing the work of a full ranch hand and making plans for an education at a college in Austin that Adelaide had found and Tobias had read about, and both of them had discussed with Arthur with the serious acknowledgement that it was his life and his choice, while also noting with complete honesty that they believed it was the right one. The conversation they had with him on a Saturday evening in 1891 about what education meant and what it was for was one of Adelaide's most cherished memories of that decade. Tobias speaking about the books on the shelf and the cattle trails, and the things that knowing things had given him access to, and Arthur listening with the focused gray-eyed attention that he had inherited from his father and that Adelaide had loved from the first time she had encountered it across a kitchen table. Mary, at 12, had already decided several things about her future with the confident precision of a person who knows her own mind early, and one of those things was that she was going to be a doctor. Adelaide had not said, "You can't," because she did not believe in saying that to people about things they were capable of, and Tobias had said, "Then you will need to know more than any man in the room, so we should start now." And they had written to Dr. Abrams for a reading list. The ranch in the late 1890s was prosperous in the steady, honest way of things built correctly over time. It was not the largest operation in the county Silas Greer's holdings, which had expanded considerably through the decade, were several times larger, but it was the most consistently productive relative to its size, and the water infrastructure that Adelaide and Tobias had designed on a hillside in the summer of 1874 had served it without significant failure for more than 2 decades. James, at 10 in 1898, had taken on the primary care of the horses, with a competence that Tobias observed with the particular pleasure of a man watching his own love of land and animals pass into the next generation. He was quieter than either Arthur or Mary had been, with a stillness about him that was familiar, and Adelaide sometimes caught Tobias watching him with an expression she recognized from the photograph taken at their wedding, which still sat on the shelf between the books. A look of recognition, as though seeing something that had always been there but was only now fully visible. The Century turned on a hill in Texas with a family on the porch watching it go, and Adelaide Ford, who had once stood at the bottom of that hill with her well-arranged opinions and her manufactured pity, stood on that porch at 49 years old with her husband's arm around her shoulders and her youngest son leaning against her side, and the valley below filled with the lights of a town that had grown and changed and kept on going the way towns do, and she felt the completeness of it down to her bones. Arthur wrote from Austin to say that he was doing well and that he had met a young woman named Clara who was studying to be a school teacher and who was, in his words, the most interesting person he had encountered in the city, and would it be too much trouble to bring her to the hill at Christmas? Adelaide wrote back the same day to say it was not too much trouble, it was a great pleasure, and she was already planning the spare room. Mary, who was in her second year of medical study at a women's medical college in Philadelphia, one of only 3 operating in the country, and she had applied to all 3, wrote long letters full of everything she was learning, and everything she found wrong with the way things were organized, and everything she was going to do about it when she was a physician, which Adelaide read aloud to Tobias in the evenings with a pride that she did not bother to conceal. James, at 14, had grown into a lean, quiet young man who spoke to horses in a near whisper, and could read a herd the way his father read a book, and who had decided, after considerable reflection, that he would take the ranch when the time came, a declaration he delivered at the dinner table one evening in the fall of 1902, with the same matter-of-fact completeness that Rupert had always brought to his significant statements. Tobias looked at him across the table for a long moment. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes," James said. "It's hard work," Tobias said, "and the reward is the work itself mostly." "I know," James said. He looked at his father steadily. "I know because I've watched you." The table went quiet with the weight of that, and then Adelaide reached over and put her hand over James's hand and said, "Then it's yours when you're ready," and that was that. Arthur married Clara in the spring of 1903 in the church in Caldwell Creek, where his parents had married 29 years before, in a ceremony that was larger and louder than the original, and that featured a reception with a better fiddle player, which Clara's father had arranged, and which Arthur claimed credit for in a manner that his mother found endearing and slightly dishonest. They settled in Austin, where Arthur worked as a surveyor and Clara taught school, and their first child, a boy they named Tobias Arthur, which caused a quality of silence at the dinner table when the name was announced that was entirely made of feeling, arrived in the fall of that same year. Mary came home from Philadelphia in 1904 as Dr. Mary Ford, the first female physician within 100 miles of Caldwell Creek, and the practice she set up in town was greeted with the mixed reception that anything genuinely new always receives, which she had expected, and which did not slow her down in the slightest. She was 26 years old and had her mother's dark honey hair and her father's gray eyes, and the comprehensive determination of both of them operating simultaneously. And within 3 years, her practice was the most attended in the county, because competence does not stay invisible for long regardless of the assumptions arranged against it. In 1906, James Ford took on the formal management of the ranch, while Tobias and Adelaide began the gradual, deliberate transition that they had been planning for years. Not a step back, but a step sideways, into the part of a life where you tend the things you have built rather than building them continuously. James hired 2 ranch hands and managed them with the same quiet authority that his father had always exercised, and the hill continued its work of growing things and feeding things, and being itself with the patient consistency of land that has been cared for. Adelaide kept her journal. She was on the 7th volume by 1906, 32 years of the Hill recorded in the careful, precise prose of a woman who had always paid attention, and had been given, by the life she was living, an exceptional amount worth recording. Bessie Hargrove, who had remained her closest friend through all the years and who had, in 1891, married a quiet widower named George who was entirely comfortable with Bessie's comprehensive social commitments, borrowed the first volume once and returned it with the comment that it should be published, which Adelaide considered and declined, because the journal was her own record and not a public document, though she allowed the thought to sit with her pleasantly for some time. The evening of their 32nd anniversary, in October of 1906, Tobias and Adelaide sat on the porch where they had sat so many evenings before, with the valley below and the stars above and the house behind them full of the accumulated evidence of a life built together. The books on the shelf, the ledgers in the study, the photographs on the mantel, the smell of coffee and wood smoke that had never changed in 32 years. James was inside reading. The dog's Anchor had been gone for 15 years, but there had always been a dog, and the current one was named Harbor. Anchor's philosophical successor, if not his biological one, was asleep on the porch steps. The stars were the same stars that Tobias had named for Arthur on this porch more than 20 years before. The valley below had more lights than it had ever had. The live oak on the east side of the hill stood in the dark above the simple stone marker, and the land around it was exactly as it had always been present, specific, entirely itself. "I was thinking," Adelaide said, "about that morning in April. 1874, he said immediately. There was no need to specify further. "I said I pitied you," she said. "You did," he agreed. "And then I became your wife." He turned and looked at her in the way he had always looked at her, with the full weight of his attention, with nothing held back, with the gray eyes that saw rather too much and had never once made her feel that too much was something to be afraid of. "The best thing you ever did," he said, "was be wrong about me." She laughed, and the laugh was the one that had started that evening in the stone outbuilding during the storm, the one she had not had for years before that, the one that came from somewhere unguarded and real. "The best thing I ever did," she said, "was climb back up the hill and tell you so." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and they sat in the October dark with the valley below them and the stars above them, and Harbor breathing on the porch steps and James inside turning the pages of a book, and the life they had built together settled around them with the easy, complete weight of something that has been constructed correctly from the beginning and has held against everything that the years have sent against it. Below them, Caldwell Creek kept its lights on in the dark. Above them, the stars kept their patterns, the same ones Tobias had learned on the cattle trails of his youth, the same ones he had named for his children on this same porch, the same ones that had always told a person exactly where they were. Adelaide Ford knew exactly where she was. She was on the hill where the man she had once pitied was the best man she had ever known, and had been from the beginning, and would be for every day that remained. And there would be many. She intended to make certain of that, because she had never once in her life done anything by half measures, and she was not about to start now. She closed her eyes and listened to the night, the cattle moving below, the wind in the live oaks, the particular rich silence of a hill that has been loved for a long time by the people who stand on it, and she was entirely and completely home,